Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories. We have stories that should thrill you a little and chill you a little.
It's amazing.
What you'll hear are adventures sent in by you guys, classic stories from the pulp mags, and episodes from the golden age of radio. We have special segments like Ghost Stories with Sylvia.
That's amazing.
And These Are Your Stories. So settle in for the next hour and enjoy the show. One more thing. You just might want to prepare yourself to be taken away from today.
Another 5-minute mystery.
This 5-minute mystery is being brought to you by the prestigious Peabody Awards.
Why are they sponsoring the show?
Hang around and you'll find out.
Are we going to have a good 5-minute mystery?
Not only good, but the perp even has a motive.
In a hospital on the east side, a dying patient gives a last expiring gasp. He's gone. Slipped through my fingers like water running through a sieve.
It's not your fault, Dr. Grant. You've done everything you could. The hospital's certainly not failed
Nurse,
to do...
this man should never have died. Something's wrong. I don't know what it is, but I'm sure that James Towner here did not die of the ailment he came to this hospital for. Nurse, I'm going to get permission to perform an autopsy.
Your hunch was right, Dr. Grant.
What is it? Tell me, Jones.
When we tested Towner's blood in the lab, a foreign substance showed up immediately. I didn't recognize it, but one of my assistants seemed to think he knew what it was. So I let him make tests. A rare poison used only by the South American Indians was introduced into the bloodstream of the victim. It killed him, all right.
But that's impossible, Dr. Grant.
Jones, did your man say whether this poison could have been taken through food or...
I thought of that, too. He swears it is the only effective way when it is taken directly into the bloodstream.
And is there any antidote?
Not known. My man says the Indians obtain a certain immunity by injecting themselves with small amounts over a long period of time.
How could that poison have gotten into Towner's bloodstream?
Doctor, I was with the patient every minute he was here. I could swear he had nothing intravenous during the whole time except the transfusions. 2 of them, which you ordered yourself.
The transfusions? Who was the donor?
Mr. Harkness, a friend of Towner's, happened to be visiting him. The friend immediately offered him blood. Towner was grateful and accepted. Harkness said something about its being the least he could do. We tested his blood and found it the right type, so we did the transfusion.
I think we ought to investigate Harkness.
But, Dr. Grant, I'm positive that Mr. Harkness did not even touch Mr. Towner during the whole time of his illness.
If what I'm thinking is true, Harkness had something to do with the death of James Towner just the same.
Well, we were certainly lucky, Doctor. There's no question about it. Harkness is your man.
I knew it. I've had Harkness investigated by the police. He's mentioned in Towner's will, gets the whole estate. The police have searched his apartment and found just what I expected. I feel my medical judgment has been vindicated, Jonesy.
You're right, Doctor. We're going to have this man Harkness arrested for the murder of James Towner.
Do you know what the doctor and the laboratory technician discovered which indicated to them that Harkness murdered his friend Towner? The doctor will tell you in a moment. But first...
Ron, are you okay?
Oh yeah, I was just testing my expiring dead guy grunt.
Well, I have to admit you did an adequate job.
Adequate? Brother, that was a Peabody-worthy performance.
Peabody.
George Foster Peabody. The National Association of Broadcasters established it in 1938 as the radio industry equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize.
You think very highly of yourself.
Don't you know it?
And now, back to our story.
Well, Doctor, what have you found?
The thing that indicated to me the fact that Harkness had a hand in the murder of James Towner was something Jones said when he spoke of the poison, and the way the South American Indians gained immunity from it. I deduced that probably, against the chance that his so-called friend would need a transfusion, Harkness had so immunized himself over a period of time. If he had, the poison would still be in his blood in some quantity, small perhaps, but enough to react unfavorably on Towner in his condition. A police search verified my hunch. And now, Harkness is being tried for one of the most unusual murders that has ever come to my attention.
Well, wrong. I have to admit that was a solid FMM.
Yep, I quite agree. I suspect that it came from early on in the series.
Why so?
Well, there are a few that make some sense. My guess is these were the bits they used to sell the product.
Then they got sloppy.
That's the kind word for it.
What's that you said?
Hello, and welcome to the podcast. On the show today, we have amazing stuff.
Ron, why do you say amazing stuff?
Well, it is the namesake of the show, after all.
Notwithstanding, but what makes it so amazing?
Well, the content, for sure.
Can you give an example?
Well, we have a review of an audiobook about the War of the Worlds.
Sounds pretty common to me.
Trust me, it's not. Then we have 3 listener stories. A maid encounters a pushy ghost, a strange reflection on the beach, and a crazy blue orb encounters a little girl.
Okay, I'm starting to see it now.
Good. Then we have a story from the 1940s where a luncheon meets science fiction.
Oh, that does sound amazing.
Then we end the show with a brief minute with Mozart.
The composer?
That's the one.
Okay, color me amazed. What do we have to do to get this going?
Cue the music. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. They have over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, computer, Kindle. Whatever you have, you can listen to Audible on it. So what am I listening to right now? The War of the Worlds, performed by Orson Welles.
Ron, was not that a radio show in the 1930s?
Yes, it was. And please use proper grammar in the future. In fact, this play was performed on October 30th, 1938 by Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater. On that Halloween night, the Earth went to war with Mars when the Martians invaded New Jersey. Now, I'll bet you're thinking, why would I want to hear that?
That is not what I was thinking.
Go with me on this, okay?
Fine.
It is a fact that people that heard that drama on that fateful night believed that what they were hearing was real. Panic ensued. Here's a clip from that original broadcast.
Kind of like a 4th of July rocket.
Yes, then what?
I turned my head out the window and would have sworn I was asleep and dreaming.
Yes?
I seen a kind of greenish streak and then zingo. Something smacked the ground, knocked me clear out of my chair.
Well, were you frightened, Mr. Wilmot?
Well, I ain't quite sure. I reckon I was kind of riled.
Well, thank you, Mr. Wilmot. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you want me to tell
No, that's quite all right. That's plenty. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard Mr. Wilmot, owner of the farm where this thing has fallen. I wish I could convey the atmosphere, the background of this fantastic scene. Hundreds of cars are parked in a field in back of us, and the police are trying to rope off the roadway leading into the farm, but it's no use. They're breaking right through. The car's headlights throw an enormous spotlight on the pit where the object's half buried. Now, some of the more daring souls now are venturing near the edge. The silhouettes stand out against the metal chain. One man wants to touch the thing. He's having an argument with the policeman. The policeman wins. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there's something I haven't mentioned in all this excitement, but it's becoming more distinct. Perhaps you've caught it already on your radio. Listen, please. Do you hear it? It's a curious humming sound that seems to come from inside the object. I'll move the microphone nearer. Here. Now, we're not more than 25 feet away. Can you hear it now? Professor Pearson?
Yes, Mr. Bell.
Can you tell us the meaning of that scraping noise inside the thing?
Possibly the unequal cooling of its surface.
I say, do you still think it's a meteor, Professor?
I don't know what to think. The metal casing is definitely extraterrestrial. Not found on this Earth. Friction with the Earth's atmosphere usually tears holes in a meteorite. This thing is smooth, and you can see its cylindrical
Just a minute.
shape.
Something's happening. Ladies and gentlemen, this is terrific. This end of the thing is beginning to flake off. The top is beginning to rotate like a screw, and this thing must be hollow.
He's moving. Keep back there. Keep back there. Keep those men back. Keep back there. Keep those idiots back. Take off. The top's loose. Look out there. Stand back.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most terrifying thing I've ever witnessed. Wait a minute. Someone's crawling out or something. I can see peering out of that black hole, two luminous discs. The eyes, it might be a face, might be almost... Good heavens, something wriggling out of the shadow like a gray snake. Now it's another one, and another one, and another one.
Now imagine that you're at home and you hear that on the radio. Nothing like it had ever been done before, and all the people had to go on was the similar broadcast that they'd heard 1 year before when the Hindenburg crashed in that very same area of New Jersey. Same type of reports and reporting. No wonder that the people believed it. This was a famous time in history that shook the world, and you can have it for your very own today. Here is what Audible has set up for us. They are offering a free audiobook and 30 days to give you the opportunity to check out their service. This includes free access to the Audible Plus catalog, which is updated monthly with new titles. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. Again, that's audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories, and you can get War of the Worlds starring Orson Welles today. Thank you, Audible.
These are your stories, sent by you, for you.
You guys keep sending in your stories, and I keep reading them. Just a reminder, if you want to tell your story yourself, that's always an option. Our first story came by telephone. Yes, that age-old contraption that allows you to speak to a person and hear for yourself what they have to say. This one comes from Detroit, Michigan. I had the pleasure to chat with Lori Phelps, who works for a maid service in the Motor City. As a maid, you never really are sure where you're going to work on any given day. They do have regulars and people that ask for them by name, but that's only part of the job. New clients are a daily occurrence, or perhaps they just hire you for a one-time cleanup. That was the case for Lori's story, that she calls a cleaning horror. On my job sheet, I had a new listing for an antique shop in Midtown. Actually, one of the safest parts of the city, and I like to work there. The job was a one-timer, and when I got there, it turned out to be a cleanup of a bathroom and 3 offices that had just been renovated. They were expanding the business to include movie prop sales and had hired new associates. When I arrived, it was already kind of strange. They told me that I was the 3rd maid that had come to attempt the cleanup. I thought maybe the work was too much and asked them to show me what was needed. I was given a tour by the owner himself. As we walked through the building, he described what had been done and what was still needed. It was actually fairly light work. The offices just needed to be cleaned and organized, and the bathroom had been closed for some time, and it was a mess. I decided to start there, and within a few hours had the place spick and span. Before I moved on, I had the owner check my work, and he was very pleased. It was then he asked me if I'd heard any strange noises or had anything happen. I wasn't sure how to answer the question. Nothing strange had happened, but it was kind of icky. You get used to that as a maid. I moved on to the office. I'd been told that it had been used for storage for years and that it didn't smell right. That was an understatement. It stunk of old cigar, rotted animal remains, and who knows what else. It was fumigation that it needs, and I called to have one of the guys come do it. Until he arrived, I set about cleaning and, unfortunately, looking for what was causing the smell. It was then I heard the voice. I turned, thinking the owner had returned, but I was alone. I must be hearing things, I thought, and set back to work. It came again, a kind of moan, like someone was injured. I looked everywhere. I even had the thought that I was on some kind of candid camera thing, but I came up empty again. I was working around the new desk when I felt my head snap back like someone was pulling my hair. "Ouch!" I screamed. The voice came again. I was just about to run out of the room when Rob arrived and said, "Man, does this stink. You find the source?" I told him what had just happened, and he just laughed. That got me to thinking that I had imagined the whole thing. We searched the room again, and this time found a dead thing in the vent. I finished cleaning, and he fumigated the place. The smell was gone, and we left for the day. The next morning I returned to finish the job. I went to the office where we had done the fumigation, and it smelled bright and wonderful. It also felt like a completely different place. The day before, there had been a heaviness that I couldn't explain. It was gone as well. 2 offices to go. The next was straightforward. I cleaned and organized it, and was quite pleased with my work. The owner stopped by and told me how much he appreciated what I had done thus far. It always feels good to have a customer say that. I set up in the last office, and that's where things went really screwy. No sooner had I begun to work when the lights went out. I walked over to the switch, and it was turned off. I turned it back on and was trying to think of how and why when the desk chair rolled across the room by itself. No one was there, and I felt a chill go through my body. I tried to shake it off and get back to work, but I wouldn't be staying any longer. I moved towards the desk, and a shadow blocked my path. I felt it push hard on my chest, and I fell to the floor. Then I screamed. The owner and a few others came running in, asking if I was okay. I remember getting up and sprinting out of the room. I didn't stop there. I grabbed my stuff, went out the door, and made my way to the closest subway entrance. I never returned. Lori Phelps, Detroit, Michigan. Lori returned to the home office and was expecting to be chewed out for leaving. That didn't happen. All she was told was how happy the customers were with her work and that she was welcome back any time. Later, she got curious and called the antique shop. She was told that the office was converted back to being a storeroom, and nobody likes to go in there. Lori, it was a pleasure to chat with you, and thank you for your story. It is amazing. Our second story comes all the way from Honolulu, Hawaii. Well, not all that far away. It seems like another world to me. A place I want to be. Our story is called Reflections of Me and was sent in by Bethany Hamilton. Hello, Ron. Thank you for the show. I have a short tale I hope you can use. Here it is. I was out walking in the local park. There are a lot of these greenways in Hawaii. We had just had a heavy rain, and that is my favorite time to walk because there's always standing water everywhere and things feel so clean. It was bright and sunny. As I walked, I had a strange sensation. I suddenly became aware that I was alive. I can't explain, but for an instant I knew that it was a fact. It was quickly replaced with another feeling that I wasn't alone. I looked around me, but there was no one there. I continued my walk, and I happened to glance over at a pool of water. Walking with me was a man. I couldn't make out any features, and the image wasn't reversed. By that I mean it looked like he was part of the water. I glanced up to look around me again, and I was still alone. I wasn't scared. In fact, I felt at peace. When I looked back to the pool once more, the image was gone. I told my husband what happened. He is a photographer and said it was just a trick of the bright sun and reflection, nothing more. I don't think so, but I don't know what I saw. Bethany Hamilton, Honolulu, Hawaii. Well, Bethany, I don't know what you saw either. Reflections can be a funny animal, but usually there is no doubt that they are just reflections. This seems like something more. Perhaps a passerby from another dimension. Who can say, except, thank you for your story. Our last story is another orb tale. And I've said this before, and I will say it again. Of all the paranormal type tales out there, these and Bigfoot are some of my favorites. It was sent in by Gennaro Winslow from Dayton, Ohio. Hey Ron, I want to tell you about my experience from a few years ago. I've told this story countless times, and I've even posted it online. Background: my dad's house is new. We built it ourselves. At the time this story takes place, it was barely a year old. Our land, however, is very old. We've seen ghosts there before, and lots of weird stuff happens. It's also a bit swampy. It goes from a grassy field to a swampy woods pretty fast on the south end of our land, and that is the area where my window faces. So, on with the story. I was 10 or 11 lying in bed one night. My dad was on a business trip, and I was home alone with my mom. Being a 10-year-old, I didn't really like sleeping all that much, but I was trying at least. I looked out my window above the forest, and I see a floating blue orb. The logical part of my brain kicks in. Is my uncle spotlighting a raccoon? No, it's a blue light, not a yellow-white light. What is this? I look at it for a minute before I run to get my mom. She was up late reading a novel, so I pulled her back into my room and told her to look at the orb. It, of course, had disappeared. She told me it was my overactive imagination and tucked me into bed again. I rolled over dejected, still unable to sleep. I'm going to guess about 10 minutes later, no clock, no phone, I look outside again and the orb is back, but a little closer. It's hovering in front of the trees and a bit lower. It's not any brighter, just closer. So I ran to get my mom again, who's still awake. By the time we get back to my room, it's gone again. This happened a few more times. Each time, the orb was getting closer. My mom had gotten very annoyed with me and told me not to bother her again after the 4th or 5th time. I'm still lying in bed looking out the window when it appears directly outside the glass. I'm frozen in fear. What is it? What did it want? Was it going to hurt me? Why? It floated through my window and into my room. It was an orb, but it was not completely illuminating my room. It was just a faint glow. It keeps floating closer to me until it's at the foot of my bed, and then I black out. I wake up some time later. The moon was still in the same general location, so not too long. I run to my window to see if the orb is still there, but instead I'm greeted with a flash of memory from some other time. A boy, my age, short blonde hair, green eyes, a smile, a storm, and darkness. The next thing I remember is hitting the floor and waking up the next morning. This isn't the first time I saw that boy. I've seen him before, in a dream, when I was a little girl. but I won't get into that here since that was a dream and not a real encounter. I told my grandmother about the orb later on. She said she had a similar experience with a red orb. Gennaro Winslow, Dayton, Ohio. Amazing story, Gennaro. I've heard many stories about orbs, and none of them have ever been negative. This, you could argue, is borderline, but reading between the lines, I got the impression that you had a fondness for that boy in your dream. Also, the fact that your grandmother had a similar experience adds much to its credibility. Thank you for sharing your story with us. Do you have a story that you want to tell on the show? If you do, we want to hear it. It can be about any subject and from any genre. Heck, it doesn't even have to be true. Original fiction or stories from the public domain are quite welcome. To submit them, head to ronsamazingstories.com and click on the story submission banner. Fill out the form, and soon your story will be heard on the show. Do you have a story but don't want to write it? That's okay too. Just leave your contact information, a brief description of your story, and I'll get back to you. We can write it together. However, if you don't do it, your story remains just that, your story. Why not share it with the world and make it our story? Our featured story comes from the pulp writers of the 1940s. Literally. I found this one while searching through the Astonishing Stories Magazine's archives. It sounded like something I wanted to review, but never thought it should be on the show. Boy, was I wrong. One thing that I really enjoy is finding things that give insight into the past. You see, the Pulp Fiction writers of the time were an especially odd group. The term pulp magazine got its name from the cheap newsprint or pulp paper that they were printed on. This kept the cost down, especially during the war years, but also meant that the magazines themselves were pretty fragile. You could practically rip a page by breathing on it, which is why it can be hard to find one in less than deplorable condition. I have a few in my own collection that flake apart if I even take them out of their plastic bag, and that is no joke. But what about the writers? Well, they were amazing folks. They earned a whopping 1 cent per word. Granted, that could be a lot in the 1940s, depending upon the length of your story. Today's story, for example, has 1,164 words. Fast math should tell you that to be $31.64. The market today pays between 50 cents and $1 per word. At 50 cents, that would be $1,582 for the same amount of work. If you convert $31 in 1942 to current dollars, you would get just over $500. So as you can see, they didn't do it for the money. So why did they do it? That is the question. Our story today takes a look at this from a unique point of view. It is a science fiction story written by Alfred Bester, who was an author, TV and radio scriptwriter, magazine editor, and scripter for comic strips and comic books. He is best remembered for his science fiction, including the story The Demolished Man, winner of the inaugural Hugo Award in 1953. Science fiction Hall of Famer Harry Harrison wrote, "Alfred Bester was one of the handful of writers who invented modern science fiction." Pretty glowing words from an amazing author. The story is titled The Unseen Blushers. It looks at the world of Pulp Fiction writers and manages to tell a pretty good story to boot. It first appeared in Astonishing Stories in June of 1942, and it is read for us by Dan Gurzinski from LibriVox.org. Thank you, Dan.
The Unseen Blushers by Alfred Bester. With all kinds of plots twisting in my head, I hadn't slept well the night before. For one thing, I'd worked too late on a yarn that wasn't worth it. For another, there'd been a high wind howling through the streets. It made me restless and did a lot more damage than that. When I got up, I found it had blown a lot of paper and junk in the window and most of the story out. Only a part of the carbon was left. I wasn't especially sorry. I got dressed and hustled down to the luncheon. That luncheon's something special. We meet every Tuesday in a second-rate restaurant and gossip and talk story and editors and mostly beef about the mags that won't pay until publication. Some of us, the high-class ones, won't write for them. Maybe I ought to explain. We're the unromantic writers, what they call pulp writers. We're the boys who fill the pulp magazines with stories at a cent a word. Westerns, mystery, wonder, weird adventure. You know them. Not all of us are hacks. A couple have graduated to the movies. A few have broken the slicks and try to forget the lean years. Some get 4 cents a word and try to feel important to literature. The rest come to the luncheon and either resign themselves to the 1 cent rate or nurse a secret Pulitzer Prize in their bosoms. There wasn't much of a turnout when I got there. Belcher sat at the head of the table as usual, playing the genial host. He specializes in what they call science fiction. It's fantastic stuff about time machines in the 4th dimension. Belcher talks too much in a southern drawl. As I eased into a chair, he called, "Ah, the poor man's Orson Welles," and crinkled his big face into a showy laugh. I said, "Your dialogue's getting as lousy as your stories." I don't like to be reminded that I look like a celebrity. Belcher ignored that. He turned to Black, the chap who agents our stuff, and began complaining. He said, "Land's sake, Joey, can't you sell that Martian story? I think it's good." Before Joey could answer, Belcher turned to the rest of us and said, "Reminds me of my granddaddy. He got shot up at Vicksburg before his father could locate him and drag him back home. Granny used to say, 'All my life I've believed in the Solid South and the Democratic Party. I believe they were good. And if they aren't, I don't want to know about it.'" Belcher laughed and shook his head. I gave Joey a frantic SOS. When Belcher gets going on the Civil War, no one else gets a word in for solid hours. Joey didn't move, but he said, "What story?" very incredulously. And then he glanced at me and winked. "That Martian story," Belcher said. "The one about the colony on Mars and the new race of Earth-Mars men that springs up. I've forgotten the title. They say James O'Brien never could remember the title of his stories either." Joey said, "You never gave me any such yarn." And this time he really meant it. Belcher said, "You're crazy." Down at the other end of the table, someone wanted to know who O'Brien wrote for. I said, "He's dead. He wrote The Diamond Lens." "He was the first pulp writer," Belcher said. "Most folks believe Poe invented the short story. Land's sake, Poe never wrote a short story. He wrote mood pieces. O'Brien was the first. He wrote great short stories and great pulp stories." I said, "If you're looking for the father of the pulp industry, why don't you go back far enough? There was a boy named Greene in the late 16th century." "You mean Groatsworth of Wit Greene?" "The very same. Only forget that piece of junk. It was his last grab at $1. Get hold of a catalog someday and see the quantity of pulp he poured out to make a living. Pamphlets and plays and whatnot." Someone said, "Greene a pulp writer?" He sounded shocked. I said, "Brother, when he turned that stuff out, it was pulp. Passes 300 years and it turns into literature. You figure it out." Belcher waved his hand. "I was talking about the invention of the short story," he said. "O'Brien," I tried to cut him off. I thought O'Brien predated Poe." "It was a mistake." Belcher said, "Not at all. O'Brien fought in the Civil War. He was with the 37th Georgian Rifles, I believe, a captain. I nudged Joey so hard he yelped. But he said, "I tell you, I never received any such story." Then Mallison grunted and sipped his drink. He started to talk, and we missed the first few words. It's always that way with Mallison. He's white-haired, incredibly ancient-looking, and he acts half dead. He used to be in the Navy, so he writes sea stories now. They say he acquired a peculiar disease in the tropics that makes him mumble most of the time. He turns out a damn good yarn. Finally, we figured out Mallison was calling Joey a liar. "Say, what is this?" Joey said indignantly. "Are you kidding?" Mallison mumbled something about Joey stealing a story of his that never got paid for and never showed up. Belcher nodded and poured wine from a bottle. He always drinks a cheap kind of stuff with the greatest ostentation. He acts as though it makes you more important if your drink comes out of a bottle instead of from a glass on a tray. He said, "I'll bet some mag paid 2 cents for it, Joey, and you're holding out." Joey snorted. "You better look in your desk, Belcher. You probably forgot to give me the yarn." Belcher shook his head. "I know I haven't got it. I can't think how I lost it." He broke off and glanced up at some people who were threading through the restaurant toward our table. There came a man, followed by a couple. The lone man I knew, although I never remember his name. He's a quiet little fellow who smokes what looks like his father's pipe. Joey says he's past 40 and still lives with his folks, who treat him like a child. One of the pair was Jinx McDougal. He turns out a fantastic quantity of detective fiction. None of his yarns are outstanding. In fact, they're all on a consistent pulp level. That happens to be why he sells so much. Editors can always depend on Jinx never to fail them. Jinx had a stranger with him. He was a tall, slender young man with scanty, tow-colored hair. He wore thick glasses that made his eyes look blurry, and he was dressed in a sweater and ridiculously tight little knickers. He smiled shyly, and I could swear his teeth were false. They were so even. I said, "You've got a hell of a nerve, Jinx, if this guy's an editor," and I really meant it. Editors are taboo at the luncheon, it being the only chance we get to knock them in unison. Jinx said, "Hi, everybody. This here's a white man that'll interest you. Name of Dugan. Found him up in one of the publishing offices trying to locate the pulp slaves. Says he's got a story." I said, "Pass, friend, and have a drink on us." Jinx sat and Dugan sat. He smiled again and gazed at us eagerly, as though we were the flower of American letters. Then he studied the table, and it looked as though he were itemizing the plates and glasses all the while Jinx was making introductions. Belcher said, "Another customer for you, Joey." Even if Jinx hadn't given it away, I could have told you he was a writer. Land's sakes, I can smell the manuscript in his back pocket. Dugan looked embarrassed. He said, "Oh, no, really, I've just got a story idea, so to speak. He said a lot more, but I couldn't understand him. He mumbled something like Mallison, only his speech was very sharp and clipped. It sounded like a phonograph record with every other syllable cut out. Jinx said, "Dugan comes from your hometown, Mallison." "Whereabouts?" Mallison asked. "Knight's Road." "Knight's Road? You sure?" Dugan nodded. Mallison said, "Hell, man, that's impossible. Knight's Road starts outside the town and runs through the old quarry." "Oh," Dugan looked flustered. "Well, there's a new vention." "A new what?" "Vention." Dugan stopped. Then he said, "A new development. That's a slang word." Mallison said, "Why, man, I was back home less than a month ago. Wasn't any development then." Belcher said, "Maybe it's very new." Dugan didn't say anything more. I hadn't listened much because I was busy watching his fingers. He had one hand partially concealed under the table, but I could see that he was fumbling nervously with an odd contraption that looked like a piece of old clock. It was a square of metal the size of a matchbox, and at one end was a coil of wire, like a watch spring. On both faces of the box were tiny buttons, like adding machine keys. Dugan kept jiggling the thing absently and pressing the buttons. I could hear the syncopated clicks. I thought, this guy is really soft in the head. He plays with things. Belcher said, "Sure you're not a writer?" Dugan shook his head, then glanced at Joey. Joey smiled a little and turned away because he's very shy about ethics and such. He doesn't want people to think he runs around trying to get writers on his string. Mallison said to Jenks, "Well, what in hell is this story?" Jenks said, "I don't know. Ask him." They all looked at Junior G-Man. I wanted to warn him not to spill anything because pulp writers are leeches. They'll suck the blood right out of your brain. You have to copyright your dialogue at the Tuesday luncheons. Dugan said, It's about a time machine." We all groaned, and I didn't worry about Dugan's ideas any more after that. Joey said, "Oh, God, not that. The market's sick of time stories. You couldn't sell one with Shakespeare's name on it." Dugan actually looked startled. "What's the matter?" Belcher asked, showing off his erudition. "You got a manuscript with Shakespeare's name on it? Discover a Shakespeare autograph on a pulp story?" He laughed uproariously, as though he'd cracked a joke at my expense. Dugan said, "No, only that's the story. I mean," he faltered and then said, "I wish you'd let me just tell you this story." We said, "Sure, go ahead." "Well," Dugan began, "perhaps it isn't very original at that, but it's what you might call provocative. The scene is the 23rd century, over 300 years from now. At a great American university, physicists have devised a time machine. It's a startling invention, of course, just as the invention of electric light was startling, but its operation is based more on sane physical laws." "Never mind the explanations," Belcher interrupted. "We've all alibied a time machine at one time or another. Land's sakes, you don't even have to anymore. You just write time machine and the readers take the rest for granted." "When the story begins," Dugan continued, "the machine has been in use for several years, but for the first time it's to be used for literary purposes. This is because back in the first half of the 20th century, there lived a great writer. He was so great that modern critics call him the new Shakespeare. He's called that not only for his genius, but because, like the original Shakespeare, almost nothing is known of his life." Mallison said, "That's impossible." "Not altogether," I argued. "It's conceivable that wars and unprecedented bombings and fires could destroy records. Why, even today there are gaps in the lives of contemporary artists that will never be filled up." "To hell with that," Mallison said. "I still say it's impossible." Dugan gave me a grateful look. He said, "Anyway, that's about what happened. The literature department of the university is going to send one of its research men back through time to gather material on the life of the new Shakespeare. This man is an expert in ancient English. He shuttled back into the 20th century, equipped with camera and stenographic devices and all that. In the short period at his disposal, he attempts to get hold of his man." I said, "It's a cute idea. Imagine going back to the old Mermaid Tavern and buying Marlowe a drink." Mallison said, "It's a hell of a dull story." "I don't know about that," Belcher said. "I did something of the sort a couple of years ago. Got $1.50 for it, eh, Joey? Also a bonus." Joey said, "Say, Dugan, you're not cribbing Belcher's yarn, are you?" "Certainly not." Dugan looked shocked. "Well, the research man had less than a day. There was some trouble locating the new Shakespeare's address, and when he did, it was already late at night. Now here's the first little surprise. The man lived in the Bronx." We smiled back at him because most of us live in the Bronx. Maybe it was a kind of sour smile, but we appreciated the irony. No bohemian Greenwich Village, no romantic New England retreat. Just unadulterated Bronx. Dugan said, He lived in an ordinary apartment house, one like a million others. The research man hadn't time enough for formality, so at 3 a.m, he learned how to operate the self-service elevator, went up to the apartment, and broke in to snoop around. He expected at least to find something different, to see in the furniture and decorations and books an outward sign of the new Shakespeare's great talent. But it was just a plain apartment, so plain that it needs no description. When I say that there are a million others like it, I've described it down to the ultimate detail. What did he expect? Joey asked. Genius? Isn't that what we all expect of genius? Dugan countered. Certainly, the research man was disappointed. He sneaked a look at the sleeping genius and saw a dull, undistinguished person thrashing ungracefully about on the bed. Nevertheless, he crept about silently, taking motion pictures, and at 3 a.m. Oh, well, Dugan said, cameras of the 23rd century and all that, you know. Could be, Jinx said, infrared photography. The little guy with the pipe bobbed his head as though he'd invented infrared rays. Then, Dugan went on, he went to the new Shakespeare's desk and gathered all the manuscripts he could find because, in his time, there were no surviving manuscripts from his hand. And now, here's the final surprise. Don't tell me, Jinx said. He'd gone to the wrong apartment? Belcher said, no, that's what I used. The surprise is, Dugan said, that the research man is doing this work for his doctorate, and he knows he'll never get his degree because even coming back to the time of the new Shakespeare, he can't gather enough material. Dugan looked around expectantly, but it had laid an egg. There was an uncomfortable pause, while Malison mumbled bitterly to himself. Jinx was very unhappy and tried to say complimentary things. I suppose he felt responsible. Only I wasn't doing much supposing, because I had the most peculiar sensation. I believed Dugan's story. I was thinking of that manuscript that had blown out the window, and I was trying to remember whether I'd used a paperweight to anchor it down. I was thinking of that gadget with buttons, and I was realizing how this mysterious Dugan slipped from one tense to another, which is a thing all writers are conscious of, and which began to have psychological import for me. But the most convincing thing of all was how the others were looking at Dugan. Belcher was staring keenly from under his black eyebrows. Belcher, who wrote that sort of stuff, and who should have been sophisticated. The little guy with the pipe was absolutely electrified. I knew it couldn't be the story, because the story was lousy even for pulp. Finally, Dugan said, "It's all there is. How'd you like it?" Malison said, "It stinks," and probed in his pockets for cigarettes. "What was this new Shakespeare's name?" Belcher asked slowly. Dugan said, "I haven't decided yet." The little guy took the pipe out of his mouth. "What was the name of the story he took?" Belcher said, "Yes, what was it?" Dugan shrugged and smiled. "I haven't decided yet. It's not really important, is it?" I said, "Dugan, when was that manuscript taken?" I know it was foolish, but I had to ask, and none of the others seemed to think it peculiar. They leaned forward with me and waited for Dugan's answer. He looked at me, still smiling, and as I stared at those blurry eyes behind the vast, thick lenses, I began to shake with uncertainty. In all that blur, there was a strangeness, a something, oh, hell! Suddenly, Belcher began to laugh. He laughed so hard he overturned his wine bottle, and we all had to scurry out of the wet. When it came time to sit down again, the spell was broken. Anyway, the luncheon was over. When I got outside, Joey was standing there with Dugan. He was saying, "I'm afraid you haven't got much of a yarn there." Dugan said, "I suppose so." Only he didn't seem put out. He shook hands with us cheerfully, said he hoped he'd see us again, and turned toward Broadway. We all waved once, just to be polite, and then lost all interest. We turned on Joey to see if we could get the price of that lunch out of him. And we kidded Jinx about the lousy stories he picked up. Maybe it was because some of us felt a little self-conscious. I know I glanced over my shoulder and felt guilty when I noticed Dugan standing on the corner. He was watching us intently and adjusting his glasses with both hands. Then I stopped haggling with Joey and turned around because it occurred to me that cameras of the 23rd century could be so small you couldn't see them at that distance. All that flash and glitter couldn't be coming just from Dugan's glasses. Yes, brother, I turned around while Gray's elegy went thrumming through my head. It could be Belcher, or Jinx, or Malison, or the little guy with the pipe. But I don't think so. I've got a pretty good idea who it is, because something suddenly occurred to me. I turned around to give Dugan a nice full face, and I waved. Because one of those scraps of paper I thought had been blown in my window was marked very peculiarly in red. Load only in total darkness. Expires December 18, 2241.
Well, it's my hope that you enjoyed that. I know that it was completely different from anything that we've ever had on the show before. But me, I was fascinated by the concept. And it got me to think, was there such a thing as the Pulp Writers' Luncheon? The answer is short and simple. It did exist, and it started out in New York as a simple get-together. Today, it is more of a convention and workshop, and it's kind of a big deal. My understanding is that it's more of a showcase for current stories and really doesn't have any ties back to that original lunch gathering. And in my book, that's too bad. Yes, it is Our Amazing Stories. But just what does that mean? We have segments for your stories, one for strange moments in history, and even one that plays clips from the golden age of radio to take us back in time. So what makes this segment different? Our Amazing Stories looks at people who did amazing things. So sit back and listen to this incredible tale. Did you know that Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was something of an 18th century child star? He acquired enormous fame and success at a very early age. The influential composer grew up listening to his father teach his older sister piano. Mimicking her playing, Wolfgang quickly began to show a strong understanding of chords, tonality, and tempo. Soon he too was being tutored by his father, and at the tender age of 5 began composing little pieces. He would play these works to his father, who in turn would write them down. With the help of his father, Mozart wrote his first symphony when he was only 8 years old. How about that? In 1762, Mozart's father took his sister, now age 11, and Wolfgang, age 6, to the court of Bavaria in Munich, in which was to become the first of several European tours. The siblings traveled the courts of Paris, London, and Zurich, performing as child prodigies. The rest of Mozart's story is one of intrigue, speculation, and quite a bit of debauchery. He was quite the character. Many myths have risen around the circumstances of Mozart's death and burial. What actually killed him is still a matter of debate, and severe strep throat seems most likely. Contrary to what Hollywood told us, Mozart was not thrown into a mass grave in a cloth sack on a dark and stormy night. He was buried in what was known as a third-class grave, typical of the middle class of the day on a cold winter night. This third-class burial is pretty weird in modern times. Mozart's grave was only guaranteed for 10 years, after which the city had the right to dig it up dispose of the remains, and recycle the grave. That is exactly what happened. His marker in St. Mark's Cemetery in Vienna denotes an approximate location of Mozart's original burial. But what about his remains? Well, some of it was thought to be recovered. His head. The story goes something like this. 50 years after Mozart's death, a man named Jacob Hertel was given a skull by a local gravedigger who claimed it was Mozart's. This skull was exhibited in Mozart's birthplace in Salzburg. In 2006, the owners employed DNA experts who compared the material from the skull to those from Mozart's grandmother and niece, who were exhumed from the family vault in Salzburg. The result? Inconclusive. A major problem was that while the DNA from the skull didn't match the two relatives didn't match each other either. Another strange twist in the story of Mozart's strange life. His career resulted in over 600 works, but very little financial stability. He passed away at the age of 35, having changed the world of music forever. Well, that's it for this edition of Our Amazing Stories. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any ideas for stories for this segment or want to write one yourself, please let me know. I would love to work with you on the project and want to hear any ideas that you might have. Just use the contact page on the main website and we'll get it done. Thank you for listening to Our Amazing Stories.
Pepsodent's new flavor. Pepsodent's new flavor. Pepsodent's new flavor. Wow! Pepsodent's new flavor. And the clean mouth taste for hours.
Yes, the big news is Pepsodent has a brand new wonderful flavor. Grown-ups prefer it, but kids, well, kids go crazy for it. And that's not all.
I've seen the research that proves Pepsodent gives you the cleanest teeth of all leading toothpastes. That's because Pepsodent's gentle oral detergent cleans not just the surfaces of your teeth, but around and between them, even where your brush can't reach.
Your own personal proof of this is Pepsodent's clean mouth taste for hours. So try new Pepsodent White. Or if you prefer chlorophyll, Pepsodent Chlorophyll. You like
Pepsodent's new flavor. Pepsodent's new flavor. Wow! Pepsodent's new flavor. And the clean mouth taste for hours.
Well, that was episode number 584, and these are the folks that made the whole thing work. Lori Phelps, Bethany Hamilton, Gennaro Winslow, and Daniel Gorzinski. Many thanks for the day to all of you. If you want to follow the podcast or the blog, head to ronsamazingstories.com. There you will find any of the links I mentioned and how to contact us. Do you want to help the show? The best thing you can do is to tell your friends all about it, and please leave reviews or feedback wherever you listen. Clicking that follow or like button helps us grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's Amazing Stories.
All of the vintage audio used in the podcast is believed to be in the public domain. Ron's Amazing Stories does not own the rights to any of the old-time radio used here. If you hold the rights to any of the shows played, please contact us immediately at ronsamazingstories.com.